If you own a classic Chevy P30 32 motorhome, chances are that while you love the styling, the floor plan, and the build quality of your coach, the way it drives might leave something to be desired. If so, then this video will help you change that. I'm Tommy Henderson with Henderson's lineup, SuperSteer, and I'm here with my dad, Robert. Now, Dad, am I right in saying that we have a few years of experience in working on these older Chevy motorhome chassis?
You could definitely say that. The P30 chassis first came out back in the 60s and was one of the first chassis used for Class A motorhomes. It was also one of the most long-lasting, as it has continued in production in the workhorse wide-track P32 form until around 2007.
And what were some of the unique features and characteristics of the P30 and P32 chassis?
Well, unlike the Ford F53, Oshkosh, and Workhorse W chassis, the P30 and P32 use an independent coil spring front suspension. This tended to give it a fairly nice ride in the front compared to the solid front axle Class A chassis of the time. However, it also meant that the front steering linkage was pretty complex. There were quite a few wear points that could develop play and lead to looseness in the steering.
And one of those wear points happens to be the first SuperSteer product, doesn't it?
That's right. The P30-32 bell crank was the first component we developed as an upgrade to replace the factory unit. The OEM bell crank used bushings which would wear out and develop play. In fact, they tended to have some play even when new. Ours uses tapered roller bearings which allow the play to be adjusted out without making the steering too tight. We also carry upgraded bell crank arms, drag links, and more.
Thanks, Dad. So there's really quite a bit we can do to reduce the play and the steering in these chassis. What are some of the other problem areas that we can help out?
Well, besides the play, the P32 coaches in particular suffer from poor returnability.
Yeah.
When Chevy upgraded to the dual-piston Saginaw steering gear, that stronger steering gear was so stiff that it made the steering tend to stick in a turn rather than come back to center for the driver. There's not enough adjustment in the gear itself to get rid of that tendency. The only thing we could do is increase the caster to fight that stiffness. However, we found that by using a self-centering steering control, like the Safety Plus, we improved the return to center while adding protection in the event of a front tire blowout. We even came up with a way to mount a second Safety Plus in some of the newer P32 coaches, which really makes the steering feel nice.
Yeah, I remember when we put that dual Safety Plus setup on our 98 Trek, and that positive return to center really did make it a lot more fun to drive without having to kind of herd it back on center after the turns.
Yes, it really works nice. The P32 chassis is also where we learn how a key role in the rear axle play affects the steering in the coach. Your Uncle John and I were working on a customer's P32. After he did a bunch of upfront work, he still said the steering wasn't right. We got to look and noticed that the rear spring eye bolt on the shackle moved far enough to contact a rear compartment over 1/4 of an inch away. We figured this probably wasn't right, so we built a prototype rear track bar to let the rear axle freely move up and down, but not side to side. So we let the customer drive without telling him exactly what we had done. Immediately, he noticed the steering was more responsive, and he didn't feel like he was chasing the steering all the time.
Yeah, it's such a cool story how you guys figured that out. And from there, we've developed quite a few more SuperSteer rear track bar applications for different coaches.
That's right. We've learned that any coach or vehicle with a solid rear axle on leaf spring can benefit from a track bar. Eric Davis figured the same thing out on the front of the early Ford F53 chassis, which used a solid front axle with no track bar. Ford finally determined that was needed up front. They added an OEM front track bar in about 2006 to higher GVW F53 coaches.
Yeah, it definitely shows the value of an upgrade when an OEM manufacturer actually starts doing it themselves.
Right on.
Getting back to the P32 chassis, what were some of the other unique challenges?
Well, I remember the nice ride of the coil spring independent front suspension. While the factory front springs rode pretty smooth, as the coaches started getting heavier, they're no longer up to carrying the extra weight. Rather than going to stronger springs, though, Chevy and later Workhorse just installed helper airbags within the front coil. Seems like a good idea, right?
I can see some potential for issues there.
Yeah, you'd be right. More often than not, the air leaks out of the bags. The owner doesn't check the pressure often enough to keep them at the correct pressure. At minimum, the lower air pressure causes low ride height in the front and increased tire wear as a result. Worst case, the airbags can go flat and get pinched in the coils to where they develop holes and won't hold air anymore.
Okay. So how did we get away from having to use those airbags?
Well, it was a challenge. We worked with a spring company to develop coil springs that were matched to the weight of the coach without having to use those pesky airbags. The one thing to note is that in order to install the correct ones, the front axle of each coach does have to be physically weighed. This is because we match the springs to the nearest 100-pound rating.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a much better solution without having to worry about keeping the right pressure in those airbags, as it's not like they're putting onboard air compressors and ride height valves to maintain that. So there's really a lot of fussing to maintain the right pressure and a couple of tiny little airbags.
Right. The coach can have confidence that the ride height is correct without having to worry about the right pressure and is being maintained in the front airbags. One point of caution, sometimes on coaches with the factory springs, they would come in with the airbags totally flat and then the front suspension riding on the bump stops. After we fixed the front springs and got them some more travel back in the front suspension, we would find that the coach now had a bit more sway than before.
Okay, and it's a really good point and does lead into another common complaint on these coaches, which is the sway. And it can get pretty bad on these, right?
No, for sure. The factory front sway bar is only 1.25 inches, which is way too small for a heavy, tall, wide motorhomes that got put on these chassis. Like I mentioned, sometimes the stability improved when the front end was totally sagged out because the bump stops are keeping the suspension from having much give. Of course, this didn't do much to help the ride quality. A better solution to go to is a bigger front bar. The rear sway bar is 1.75 inches. There wasn't much space to bump its size out. But we can also upgrade the rear bushings to polyurethane to let that bar work better too.
Okay. Now, what about the wide track P32 that Workhorse came out with in the late 90s? It actually came from the factory with a bigger front sway bar, right?
Yeah, it did come with the 1.5 inch front sway bar, which is the same diameter as what we install. Actually, we actually install 1 5/8 on the older ones. But when they widened out the front track width and the sway bar, they didn't widen the mounting points out for the saddle brackets. This meant the bar was free to bend in a way it wasn't intended to, rather than twist the sway bar as it was supposed to. As a result, the sway bar didn't work as well, and in many cases, the saddle brackets wound up breaking.
Okay, in that case, you're left with basically no front sway bar at all. So the solution would be to then widen out those mounting points then?
Yep. Yes, and Roadmaster makes what they call a spreader bar kit to do just that. With this kit installed, the front sway bar is able to function correctly on those wide track P32 coaches.
Definitely a good way to go. So now we've covered most everything related to the suspension on these, but what about the shocks? Where do they fit in?
Well, that's super important. The shocks are really critical in these to control the body movement. If they aren't functioning right, you can get a lot of bouncing and rocking, especially on the shorter wheelbase to get the porpoising.
Okay, our 98 check definitely fits the category of short wheelbase. The Koni FSD shocks tend to be the best option for these coaches, right?
So far, it's the best that we've found on them. They have a nice balance of the ride and handling, especially with the frequency selected dampening feature that lets the suspension move freely over small imperfections in the road while staying tight when it's really needed, such as through dips in the road, in and out of driveways.
Okay.
Now, in some cases, we have found that we still want a bit more control than what a single set of FSD shocks provide. For these cases, we have a rear quad shock kit, which lets us mount 4 shock absorbers on the rear axle. This really helps with that bounce and sway like on the short and top-heavy tracks. Along with the quad conies in the back, the Sumo Springs also do a good job of adding support. They look like a bump stops, but they're made from microcellular polyurethane, which allows them to act like a mix of a rising rate dampener and overload spring.
Okay. Well, Dad, that was a great summary of the common steering and handling issues on the P30 and P32 chassis.
Yeah, we didn't even get into the brakes. Basic maintenance takes care of many of the issues on these, but there's some upgrades available there as well with better rotors and friction material.
That's right. Yeah, all those coaches tend to have pretty spongy brakes even when they're functioning correctly, but it doesn't help when your caliper slides are frozen up.
No.
Well, that does it for this video. Is there anything else we didn't cover that you wish that we did? If so, let us know in the comments. We'd also love to hear any stories you have about your P32 or other classic motorhome. And if this video is helpful, please like and subscribe. And again, if you have any questions about what we covered, please comment below. And as always, we want to wish you
safer and happier driving.
Yes, it can be improved.